Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this morning's session. I can see that we've got a great number already online, and no doubt we'll have a few more people joining over the next little bit. My name is Sophie Devitt. I'm a partner here in the insurance team in Brisbane. So good morning from sunny Brisbane. You can't see it from my background. As a global sponsor of the Dive-In Festival, DLA Piper's really excited and honoured to partner today with one of our clients, AON, in today's session, in providing today's session and the discussion on levelling up business. We often acknowledge here at DLA Piper that there's no shortage of talent, but certainly opportunity is not everywhere and not for everyone. So it's often in that context that we are conscious that people's backgrounds are one of the key indicators of their likely outcomes in life. And so today, with an incredible panel of speakers, we're here to discuss how businesses can address that and overcome some of these systemic barriers to impact social mobility. We really are excited because we have our own DLA Piper program, global program Head Start, which aims to develop equality of opportunity in the business of law across the world. And the program's mission is to support the education and professional journey of individuals from underrepresented groups who have a desire to succeed in the business of law. So we hope through that program that we can help play a part in increasing diversity in our firm and beyond. In Australia, we're really proud to be part of the Career Trackers program, which links up pre-professional Indigenous university students with multi-year paid internships in the firm. And excitedly, in 2019, we had our first graduate join us from that program, which is fantastic here in the Brisbane office. In New Zealand, we partner with the Prince's Trust, and in 2020, the inaugural year of the program, we are supporting two Pacifica students, female school students from Auckland Girls Grammar. So we're trying to be part of the solution and to really grow that diversity within the business of law. And we recognise that, and without doubt, that we're a stronger profession and just stronger people as a group if we can get the diversity right in how we conduct ourselves and our business. So I'm really looking forward to today's session. I really encourage everyone who's online to take this opportunity to ask questions through the question function on the WebEx, so that we can make the most of the time that our panellists have kindly given to us today. So I'm now going to hand across to my colleague, Misha Hennigan, to take us through this panel discussion. Over to you, Misha.
Thanks, Sophie, and thank you everyone for joining us today. As Sophie said, my name is Misha Hennigan. I'm a partner in DLA Piper's specialist insurance practice based in Auckland here. I'll be facilitating today's Dive-In Levelling Up panel discussion. Before we get started, as Sophie said, our real intention is for this to be quite free-flowing because we've got this magnificent set of panellists here. And so there's a question and answer feature in the bottom right-hand corner of your screens. So do feel free to put those through. The audience as a whole can't see it, but all the panellists and Sophie and I can see those. And Sophie will ask those throughout the session, not just at the end. So we do intend for that free-flowing for it to be a free-flowing session. And we're also recording the session, so it'll be sent out to all the audience. We have a huge a number of registrants that have joined this panel. Now, to introduce you to our three esteemed panellists. Firstly, we have Anya Satyanand. Anya is the Chief Executive Officer of the Prince's Trust. It's a charity which really supports New Zealanders, and which, as Sophie mentioned, we're privileged at DLA Piper New Zealand to be partnering with them in our Head Start program. Anya was previously the Chief Executive of Ara Tai Ohi, which is also a youth development organisation. So obviously, Anya is incredibly passionate about our young people, and in particular, she's incredibly passionate about our young people's role in the future of our economy, of our communities, and our democracy. Anya believes wholeheartedly that young New Zealanders need to be understood as the designers, workers and creators of a more equitable and sustainable New Zealand. We also have Ewen Anderson as our second panellist. Ewen has a really strong commercial background with more than 25 years working across a range of industries, including the building industry and the tech industry. He was previously the investment director for the strategic philanthropy fund, the Next Foundation, which many people in New Zealand would have heard of. At Next, Ewen worked with a number of the foundation's environmental and educational investments, which is the foundation's focus, including in areas that provide a strategic leadership for school principals. And he also assisted with addressing equity and access to education through collaborative, digitally enabled learning. And our third panellist, Ewen was recently appointed the CEO of the Dilworth Trust Board, one of New Zealand's largest charities that provides the funding to support Dilworth School and its scholarships to students from families experiencing personal or financial hardship. And our third panellist is Clementine Johnston. So Clementine's calling us from the UK, so it's very late at night for her. So thank you to Clem for that. Clementine has 15 years experience creating and delivering community development programs around the world. She currently leads DLA Piper's social impact team and our agenda. She works on social impact strategies with DLA Piper's clients and in collaboration with community organisations, universities, think tanks and institutions. As we all know, an accepted part of the social licence to operate is having a positive impact in the communities in which our businesses operate. We've all seen increasingly social impacts are being considered by a range of stakeholders, including investors and regulators, and how that can be really important and is a prerequisite for project approval. Clementine supports our DLA Piper clients at the design and concept phase of new initiatives, and she ensures programs are reported in a manner that delivers the maximum benefits in terms of ESG ratings, so environmental, social governance ratings, access to ethical and impact investor funds, and also regulation and brand value. So we have a wonderful set of panellists here today. And as Sophie said, we're here to talk about levelling up business. We hope that we can have a really productive session today to raise awareness of these issues and to look at some real practical measures that businesses can take. Before we move into the how, which I think will be the majority of our discussion today, I thought it would be first useful to set the scene and discuss the what and the why. What are the issues we are facing, and why is it something that we as businesses should be addressing? So Clementine, firstly to you, in your experience, what are the barriers for young people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds? And also, we've also heard about how COVID has amplified disadvantages, so it'd be good if you could also address how COVID has affected this.
Absolutely. It's really nice to be here. Thank you so much. And you're right, this is a really important moment for us to be having this conversation. So I think you put it brilliantly, and I think we all now have a shared understanding of social mobility, and it's basically that how a young person growing up in a low-income household or in a high deprivation area is much more likely, because of a lack of access to quality education, role models and opportunities, it's much more likely to end up living in a low-income household or in high deprivation areas as an adult. And I know Anya's going to talk a little bit more about why this is bad for our communities and society as a whole, but it's really bad for business. Diverse businesses that genuinely reflect our communities are much more successful businesses. They lead us away from groupthink. They promote, greater cohesion within our businesses. So it's really important for all of us to think about the makeup of our businesses and be thoughtful about that. So just to summarize, why is it that young people from low-income backgrounds are not accessing education and opportunities? What's going on here? And I'm working in the UK, but this is a global issue. There's no country that has this absolutely right. And I know from my research, New Zealand and Australia have very, very similar issues to the UK. So just to put it really quickly, there is an access to quality education for many people from low-income backgrounds, a lack of role models as well, a lack of aspirations and confidence growing up in areas where in schools which are underperforming and under-resourced, for example. Geography can play a factor. The fear of moving away for study or employment opportunities can be a real barrier for young people. A lack of networks, ability to secure work experience. In a lot of industries, internships are still unpaid, and that is just out of reach for many young people from low-income backgrounds. Also, businesses really focusing on recruiting polish over potential, not having a clear definition of talent and what their business needs to succeed. And of course, biases in our systems. And that is we see that in everyday life. So COVID has amplified inequality across the world. I read today that we expect in 2020 that there'll be 50 million more people plunged into poverty. And we've seen that, young people who are studying, who've been, asked to study at home, that has had a very challenging and negative impact on people in low-income households. So 2020 is the time to have this conversation, to really address the inequality and work out how we can come together. And we're not going to do this on our own. It requires business, government, the education sector and the third sector to really work together on this issue and help these young people reach their full potential.
Thank you, Clem. That's a great context. And Anya, moving on to you, you've dedicated your career to empowering young people. Can you tell us about the long-term societal benefits of ensuring no young person is left behind, flowing into Clem's discussion just now?
Yeah, and I just, fantastic context to be set behind this discussion today, because actually, if I think about my experiences working with young people, have given me an evidence base about young people's limitless potential. So their contribution and participation in our economy as entrepreneurs and workers, their contribution to our communities as volunteers, as, really important members of our community. Some of the things that we're noticing here in New Zealand that I know exist in lots of different contexts as well. Young people are becoming super diverse at a faster rate than any other demographic. And actually that is an incredible, it's a superpower to tap into as well. I also think that at this time, young people's contribution and participation, sense of connection to our democracies are incredibly important as governments work to intervene and to create a COVID response where people's well-being is protected, where economies are insulated from the worst effects of the pandemic, but actually our democracies rely also on young people's sense of connection and participation within them. I totally agree with what Clem has said about COVID really illuminating the challenge, and it also creates an opportunity for real change in this space. So how can we foreground a really inclusive sense of how our economies work and serve communities? I know that here in New Zealand there's really good data around New Zealanders consistently demonstrating a commitment to equity and fairness, and I think in lots of the different cultures represented around the table on this panel, that actually that's something that is really core to our sense of who we are, that equity and fairness is super important within our communities and within our cultures. However, I think it kind of even more than that, as Clem has said, that the human potential of our future innovators, our scientists, our creatives and entrepreneurs, we potentially lose these things if some of the patterns around social mobility continue in the way that they are heading at the moment, with a lack of movement between the strata in our society, that lack of opportunity for young people to kind of get ahead and to forge new paths for themselves. So really it comes down to young people as really important contributors and participants in our society, in our economy and within our democracy as well.
Thanks, Anya. And we'll move on to an audience question soon, but first I thought before we talk about how can we do things about this, this situation. Ewen, it would be helpful for you to just address, in your opinion, where do you think New Zealand and Australia is at a starting point? You know, how prepared are our businesses to enable social mobility?
Okay, sure. And good morning, everybody. So I can talk more confidently about New Zealand, of course. I have some sense of Australia, but not as much. I think we've got all the right ingredients to make this happen. But I think we shouldn't underestimate the challenge. I don't want to sugarcoat it. I guess I would say my observation would be New Zealand is speaking particularly about New Zealand, we're a very egalitarian society, so that's fantastic. But we're also a pretty conservative society, particularly the areas of New Zealand society where the power sits. So that's not easy to overcome. And as Clem and Anya have talked about, the inequality measures are not heading the right direction, and that's not just because of COVID. So we have a lot of challenges, and it's not easy. I think it comes down to education and leadership, and I think when I talk about education, I mean educating businesses as well as our young people. Businesses understanding what as Clem was talking about before, what the real opportunities are for them. And I think leadership and role models are a key component of that. And I think we need to be really aspirational, and people really need to take ownership. But I guess I want to emphasise it's not easy. It's not easy.
Yeah. Thanks, Ewen. Sophie, do you have a question from the audience before we move on to the how?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the question that's come through is, do you think that, given what's just been discussed, that businesses have an understanding of what these barriers are, like even just appreciating and recognising that they exist in real terms, not just in sort of the conceptual sense? I'd be interested to know the panelists. That's the question to the panelists.
I'll start if you like. And Sophie, just to clarify, do people realise that these issues exist? Is that the question?
Or do businesses understand the implications of, I think is the question, of these issues?
My perspective from business sector is generally no, or not to the extent that they should. I think a lot of people that make these that make the decisions that drive business are the privileged majority, like myself. So it's very easy to not see a lot of these issues and to not recognise, or certainly not fully recognise, what a lot of the opportunities are. So,
yeah. Clem, it would be interesting to hear your perspective from the UK. We can hear you.
We can hear you.
Can you hear? Oh, great. Okay, sorry about that. So I think there is a very good understanding of businesses that this is an issue in our communities. I think different sectors have different approaches, and the sectors that are collaborating are by far and away doing better than the sectors who aren't, and who haven't sort of got a shared understanding of what the barriers are for young people for their particular sector. And it is different. I've been working in the legal sector for a really long time, and the barriers remain. It is still a profession that is dominated by people who speak in a certain way and who have a certain level of confidence, and those things can really be intimidating for some people. But I would also say this: what's happening in the UK is that mandatory reporting is coming. So I think businesses more and more understand that they need to have a social license to operate. I think government is going to be looking to business in how we rebuild communities post-COVID. And I think that's going to be more and more on our board's agendas. So I think the business does understand. I think senior people are engaging in these conversations very regularly. I think the challenge for business is really pinpointing what policies or practices they have in place which have a real impact on young people entering their business, and then people succeeding through the business and moving up through the business. And that's because we're all a little bit scared of data. We haven't probably built that trust with our people to collect the data that we need. And we're all just sort of a bit tentative about that. But I think, in my experience, the conversations are being had. The issue is on the table. We're going to be reporting on it, just like we do for gender pay gap reporting. And we just need to be bold and get on with it.
That's great, Clement. Sophie's got a follow-up question to the audience question that I'll get her to ask in a minute. But Anya, I think your perspective is the organisation that's trying to connect the youth to the businesses. It would be really interesting to hear about, is that quite hard to penetrate, and what, your perspective from the other side of the fence?
Yeah, the other side of the fence, which is so weird, isn't it? That we have these kind of false divisions, or this sense of of separation between the private sector, between the public sector, and between kind of people working in community. One of the things that has been one of the most exciting things about my job is really tuning into an appetite from business to actually engage in this space. And I'll talk a little bit more about this later on, but I actually fundamentally think that we need to be smashing down the walls a little bit. Like the way that we will solve these problems and rise up to meet this challenge is actually by creating collaborations that stretch across community. I talked about, I was talking about young people in terms of their strengths, and I think the same thing is true here, right? If we can create some cross-sector collaborations where we tune into businesses, discipline and agency around creating new economic pathways for young people to grow up within their business, we can activate some of the superpowers from government to kind of set up social procurement parameters around young people's employment, and then work with NGOs who are actually really fantastic at working with young people. I mean, that is the kind of collaboration that speaks to the size of the challenge that Ewen has set out. It is difficult, but actually we have the tools and the competencies and the capabilities to meet the challenge.
Thanks, Anya. And Sophie, the follow-up question?
Yeah, and I think that the follow-up question really feeds into what I was just saying there in terms of that engagement with the businesses. And so maybe, Anya, this is a question for you in some respects, or at least, a perspective on it. In a cost-conscious environment, how can we convince businesses, business decision makers, that they should be doing this as a priority to invest in programs and partnerships to support bringing in diverse talent?
Yeah, I mean, I think to a certain extent it goes back to what Steve was talking about in terms of the social license to operate, but also the value proposition of young people with their different way of thinking about the world, their future. They're not just future employees, they're actually also future consumers. So thinking about how businesses can tap into some of that kind of expertise that young people bring in being, consumers and workers of the future is super important. Understanding that it's not just about kind of businesses investing and putting resources and expending energy on something, that actually there's huge value that they will get back from engaging in this space as well.
Thank you. That's great for setting the context as to the why we should be doing something as businesses. Now let's invest some time talking about the how, because obviously compared with race and gender, it's something you can't necessarily tangibly see. And so Ewen, at the Next Foundation, we know you treated philanthropy as a business, and you only invested in projects that had the potential to trigger significant impact. Firstly, should social change be treated like any other business metric in trying to implement this? And secondly, how do you identify which projects have the ability to drive that change? And then how do you monitor and measure their impact?
Sure. Well, I can certainly talk from the Next Foundation's perspective. I think the question about treating social change as a business, it's very easy to give a misleading answer. My short answer is yes, but my long answer is definitely not yes. It's social change is very, very fundamentally different to business, and very, very different drivers. Business is largely driven by competition. Social change, in my view, is much more driven by collaboration. And I think businesses, are seeing that collaboration is an important part of their fabric. But historically and fundamentally, business is driven by competition. I think, however, there is a lot of the disciplines that businesses have developed over centuries, frankly, that can be incredibly useful in social change. So things that are, at least in business, simple boilerplate, just the way you do things, are not always the way things are done in social. So things like having a very clear definition of the need. And that sounds simple, but often that's the hardest thing, to actually really understand what the need is you're trying to address. And we would always encourage projects to spend a very significant amount of time up front really clearly defining their need. Then developing a really clear plan how to address that. Running things in a business-like way. So that's about having good governance in the way you do things, having good management structures, being set up for success, knowing what success will look like, and how you're getting there, knowing what your measures of success are. And your measures are much easier in the business sector because it's not always quite as simple as the dollars on the bottom line, but it's pretty close. In the social sector, far more nuanced. So it's not easy, but you have to challenge yourself to figure out what those measures are. Otherwise, you don't know if you're actually making any impact. So all that kind of thinking, I think the business sector can help very much in the social change sector. We at Next Foundation, we would look. I guess what we were particularly interested in was social change initiatives that met all those, but also were very transformational and inspirational in their goal. So they really inspired people. We were looking for projects that had fantastic leadership, and in fact, the projects that had the key person leading them that we felt could bring this inspirational leadership. That was almost the most important thing we looked at, and we were looking for projects that were large scale that could actually make a difference. So they might be relatively small in their community, but they would have to be able to apply it on a much larger scale ultimately. So they had to actually move the dial. So those were sort of some of the things we looked at, and maybe the last point I'd make is we look at things that were done in a sustainable way, because you can burn bright for 2 or 3 or 5 years and then fizzle out, and then everything you've done is lost. You have to think from the beginning, how are you going to sustain what it is you're trying. So those are the sort of things that we looked at, and I think bringing a very business-like lens, but listening a lot and not trying to bring a business thinking, if I can make that distinction.
Yeah, and obviously the Next Foundation, that was one of its purposes. Do you have any tips from your business lens about what businesses could do to even just define their goals at the beginning? Like, who could they partner with or reach out to, or how do you even set that initial goal, which then dictates everything else?
If you're talking about social mobility, you mean, or
yeah.
I'm probably not the best person to answer that. It's probably okay. Anya or Clem.
Yeah. Okay. Anya, do you want to flow on from that?
Yeah, interesting. I mean, I'm sort of thinking about that idea of sustainability. How do you create an initiative that actually will work towards impact at scale in terms of, the number of communities or the number of people who get great outcomes as a result of it, but actually also in terms of time frame. And I think, again, just coming back to this idea of partnerships, actually business partnering with community, partnering with government, that is another kind of way of ensuring kind of sustainable outcomes, but also impact and scale. I mean, I think one of the things that I just want to name, because we've been talking about, and it's hugely relevant to any discussion about social mobility, is this idea that I think exists certainly in New Zealand, that that education is sort of a disruptor in terms of inequality, right? That we believe that education serves as a kind of potential, thinking about a game of snakes and ladders, right? That like education forms one of those incredible ladders that enable people to kind of change the trajectory of their family, really, and their intergenerational patterns of deprivation potentially. And I think any question about partnerships when we're talking about social mobility needs to include this question of education. I don't think that's have this on their own, and actually working alongside schools is a really, really important dimension of any plan to create impact and to change some of these patterns. And I say that as a recovering teacher. I spent a lot of my working life working in schools and secondary schools here and in the UK, and I think schools are tasked with an enormous amount, and actually this is a really powerful space for business to kind of get alongside education and support young people with experiences of business. So how do you forge those partnerships? Think about the place that education might play, but also think about which civil society organisations you could work alongside.
That's great, thank you, Anya. So, and yes, so reflecting on education and assistance with that, Clem, as an employer, from an employer lens, how do we ensure we're employing practically a diverse workplace?
Yeah, absolutely. So we always think about it in 3 steps. So our outreach work to ensure that people are thinking about a career in law, people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds are aspiring and have the confidence to choose to study law. And then it's about really thoughtful recruitment. And there are some very practical things that employers can start to do straight away to reduce bias within their recruitment processes. And then, of course, it's the inclusion. So ensuring that young people from these backgrounds want to stay and continue to contribute, because unfortunately, we do see, particularly in the sort of first 2 to 5 years of a young lawyer being in a big commercial law firm, that young people from low income backgrounds are much more likely to leave. So when we talk about sort of the pipeline and our outreach programs, we run a program called Head Start, and I think it's really important for businesses to be clear on their intention. What are they trying to do? This is not about serving volunteer hours for your people in order to hold on to people, to give them some sort of sense of purpose. This is about contributing to a social issue, contributing to the discussion across the sector, to be genuinely open to collaborating with NGO partners and government, and being transparent and open that we don't have all the answers, we need to work together. So then the pipeline stuff, so making sure, really understanding and reflecting the experience of those young people back into our business. How can we learn from them? What are they saying to us? What are the barriers that they're experiencing? We also know from running these programs for a really long time that it's not one intervention that's going to make the difference. It's multiple interventions, it's multi-year engagement. So all of the programs that we run are at least 2 years. It's many opportunities to learn from us and engage with us and our clients as well. So then it's about, is a fantastic tool. It really reduces those biases. It puts a young person's performance and their grades into context. If they are outperforming their peers at the schools that they went to, they have enormous potential. So to really prioritise meeting those young people, and then making all your assessments competency-based, not making them about interviews, and not talking to them about what book they read, and just removing those sorts of silly questions that really don't mean anything. It's not about the pub test anymore, whether you like the candidate that sits in front of you. It's really understanding what your business needs to be successful. And then it's of course the inclusion and making sure that there is the place that where people come to work every day is a fantastic place, and where everybody is accepted, and there isn't a dominant culture that makes some people feel uncomfortable, where people are talking about, you know, going to Europe every summer and those things that, you know, that are inaccessible to some people from low-income backgrounds. So to challenge those sorts of behaviours, that sort of culture, and have a very clear path for everybody in the organisation, having role models, and having role models who speak confidently and proudly about their background, and having that as a superpower rather than something that they might feel a little bit embarrassed about.
Yeah, so it's not just creating the diversity, it's having the inclusive environment, which we'll develop further. But Sophie's got a follow-up question that she'll from the audience.
Thanks, Misha. This is for you, Clem, in terms of that inclusivity point, and your views on how a business, once the person is in the business, and I know you've given some examples there, but how does a business, given that social standing is sort of a learned experience for people who are in the business, and we know from law firms that they often do come from privileged backgrounds, essentially a lot of particularly our law graduates in the past. How do you provide that necessary support within a business without isolating the person you're providing that support to, or making them feeling vulnerable because of their differences, and of course celebrating those differences? But in practice, how do you get the rest of the business along on that journey, not just, you know, very enlightened people like yourself and others on this panel?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good question, because it's not easy, and it's absolutely a journey for most organisations. You know, even 7 years ago when I came to the UK, DLA Piper, which is an extremely socially mobile business, wasn't comfortable talking about the makeup of who we were and where we recruited. You know, it sort of wanted to have this vision, because it thought that clients expected everybody to have gone to the top schools and the top universities. But actually, we've dispelled those myths. That's not what clients and our key stakeholders expect. It's not a mark of our success. And so we've changed a lot of the language about who we are and who we want in our business. So that's right. Inclusion is a choice, and it is and it really makes a better business, doesn't it? Because if you come to work every day and you can't bring your full authentic self, you're not going to be able to perform at the level of your full potential. And that's just bad for business. Having people walking into the office every day and thinking, oh, I've got to adjust my accent or the way I speak, or, you know, I've got to pretend that I'm something that I'm not, takes all their energy, and it doesn't help them to be the best that they can be. So it's absolutely, you want to challenge that. And there's lots of ways that people can do it, and lots of sort of small interventions that you can do every day. I'm a really big believer in mentors and supporting young people. So all trainees in our business are now matched with mentors. And that's not about picking some people, but in a mentoring relationship, we really support our people to have those conversations. You know, how's it going? What's your experience like? And try and help a young person to kind of understand and celebrate who they are, and bring that confidence. But also providing forums for people to speak to each other, and really understanding their lived experience, and then what you can do. It's also it's something that is set from the top and all the way through. So our leaders need to be role models. They need to be talking about diversity across the business, celebrating that, and making sure that it's everybody's business, really. Inclusion is everybody's business. We all have a role to play, and leaders need to be really enthusiastic about having a diverse work culture, and making sure that everybody from every background feels included, and that they have a real role to play and career opportunities. So it's not easy. I would definitely say that, but it's really, really important. And I think with sort of small interventions, you can create quite a lot of momentum quite quickly.
Thanks, Clem. Anya, I'd be really interested in hearing from you as well about how ideas to change the culture of businesses to create a more inclusive environment for the people.
I mean, I think one of the really fascinating things about co-designing the Head Start program for the New Zealand context has been tuning into the fact that actually law firms have a culture. So it's not just saying young people are arriving in this business with their culture and we want them to kind of show up with their whole selves. It's actually also recognising that there is a culture that exists in the law firm, and it's an amazing culture, but it's not, often I think the culture in which we sit and are steeped is kind of invisible to us. So it's about actually shining the light on that a little bit and understanding how that culture could be oriented towards inclusion and getting intentional about that, gaining some kind of literacy and some kind of critical awareness. In education, there's this idea of culturally responsive pedagogy, and what that means is that it's a model of teaching and learning that actually enables young people to integrate new knowledge, to engage in learning in ways that kind of hooks into their own culture and their prior knowledge and their own kind of sense of the world and worldview. And I think that's ultimately what's needed within businesses in some ways is for businesses to become culturally responsive to clients, to consumers, to employees, and really to the world. So I think it is also about not just thinking about culture as something that young people are bringing in, but something that actually exists in the fabric of a business.
Thanks, Anya. And Ewen, do you have any comments about that cultural change and what you can do to create an inclusive environment from your business lens?
Sure. I think, and I love the comments from Clem and Anya on this. I probably don't have quite as much to add, but I think you should recognise that you're always going to have within your environment, you're going to have a bunch of advocates. You're going to have a bunch of people that are already on board, just like with any change process. And you're going to have a bunch of people, most people who are fairly indifferent to the change, and you're going to have some people who are actively, want to stop the change, whatever that change is. So you need to figure out a way, I think, to support your advocates and to help move the indifference, and don't worry about the people that are going to be actively pushing against this, because you're going to move them anyway. Your focus should be on that sort of that top end, if you like, and hopefully the leadership within that organisation sits in that advocates camp. Got a real problem if they don't, but if you've got that, and I think back to a point I made earlier, education is so critical here. It's not just education for young people, it's education for businesses. It's explaining to them what this can do. You're not only giving people the license to think in a different way, you're also giving them the tools internally within their organisation to advocate. You give people the tools to be able to say to their boss or to their peers or their employees, this is why we're doing this, this is why it's important. So I think being able to get simple messages across businesses that really succinctly explain what the advantages are, and as I say, both give them the ability to get it more themselves and give them the ability to advocate more internally. I think that's just one, in addition to many of the great things that Clem and Anya talked about. I think that's one really important approach.
That's really helpful, Ewan. So you're saying identify your allies, find out your stakeholders and influence them. And one way, obviously once you've got them listening and you've educated them, obviously boards will want reporting on this and measurements of change and what we're doing about this. So I think it would be useful to now talk about, what some practical measures we can take to track retention and progression in that, to show we're actually having an impact in this social movement. And happy for you to kick that off, Ewan, if you've got some ideas.
Oh, sure. So how do we get boards to, what information do we give to boards and to our CEOs and to our senior leadership? I would say, it's throughout the organisation. well, I guess there are simple measures around the type of people we're employing. It's more about the change we're making. So it's about the people that we're bringing on board, more so perhaps than the existing nature of the organisation. I think it's pretty simple to track recruitment statistics and retention statistics. That's very simplistic, but it's a good start. I think it's probably an area Clem's better to speak to than me, I suspect.
Sorry for putting you on the spot there, Ewen.
That's all right.
That's really helpful. Yeah, Clem and Anya, I'd be interested to hear from you as well. Clem, perhaps you first as a tracking and measuring tools that can practically be applied by businesses.
Of course. So data is the key. We all know that. I think it's really important to have a shared understanding of what are the relevant metrics for assessing someone's social background. So there's lots of, there's the Gini, there's lots of different metrics that businesses can tap into, but it's probably useful to have a shared understanding in each country. And I know in Australia and New Zealand, you've got lots of really fantastic data on schools and high deprivation areas, and household incomes as well. So really pinpointing, so what are sort of 5 to 10 metrics or data points that you want to be collecting from your people. And you've got different points that you can collect that. Obviously on application is ideal because you want to be tracking who's applying to you. So in the legal profession, 50% of applications for trainee contracts come from the top 10% of schools in the country. That's in Australia. So that tells you that those applications are really dominated by people who are already at high performing schools and have those role models and networks most likely. So you've got application data, and then you've got onboarding data. So if you didn't get it at application stage, it's really important to get it when people join your organisation. But of course, it's really important to tell them why you want to get that information, because people might feel sensitive about it. And if you didn't do that, or if that hasn't been part of your processes within your business, what we've recently launched is an employee engagement survey, and it's going to be an annual event where we ask employees about their experience at DLA Piper, but we also ask them some social background questions. So each year we know that the people participating in that survey and answering those specific questions will increase, and that's going to improve our data and how we can kind of measure our success. But at the same time, we have put in place goals, and we've been really transparent with our people about what we're trying to collect, why we're trying to collect it, and where we want to be in the next 5 years. And that's really important because the dialogue is with your people. You're going to be learning all the time about their experience, what's meaningful for them, what makes a difference. It might be that in your organisation you have a resource group or network, and that can be a great source of information and inspiration. But it's just important to build that trust with your people. What's the information that you need to collect, and why are you going to collect it, and how is this going to benefit me, as employees across the business? So that's what I would say. But I genuinely don't think any business or sector has nailed it. So we're all at the, we're all learning together.
Yeah, and one of the points you raised, Clem, it's quite long term. It's 5 years. It's not like talking like an immediate 6-month result. Anya, would be interested to hear from you on this question as well.
Well, and it's so interesting to hear this discussion, because I think one of the things, if we're genuinely talking about social mobility, what we need to recognise is that graduates of law school some of the data from New Zealand universities shows that as few as 2% of graduates of law schools are actually from high deprivation, kind of low decile originating schools. So actually, if we're seeking recruits who have already navigated their way through the tertiary education system, it amplifies privilege and it amplifies disadvantage as well. So if we're wanting to kind of disrupt and be agents of change, I really think that the kind of approach that DLA Piper New Zealand has deployed in the design and development of the Head Start program for here, which looks at secondary schooling and works with schools to identify students who are interested in the law and business, but who might not necessarily be surrounded by role models, and actually backs them for 5 years on their journey through tertiary education. That's the kind of radical and disruptive approach that I think actually addresses some of the kind of core issues that that we face in terms of social mobility in New Zealand. And the other thing that I'd just say is that actually in terms of you know, data and using data to evidence social change, two things that I know. One is quantitative data really matters, both in terms of inputs and outputs. So if we're talking about the data landscape of right now, actually we need to be responding and intervening responsively to the data that's emerging about how COVID is affecting young people. And what we know is that young women are being disproportionately affected, that down the track where, you know, we know that unemployment, underemployment and deprivation is going to be the next decade for lots of our young people. So responding to that. The other part is don't discount the power of stories as a really important alternative data set. Stories are what change hearts and minds, and really, you know, empowering young people in your businesses to talk about their own story it's incredibly powerful in terms of how that lands on board tables and changes the mindset of boards when they're thinking about these sorts of issues. Like, stories are so important. So yeah.
No, that's great. And just one final comment from you, Ewen, perhaps, because I know at the Next Foundation, because I went to the program myself, you deal with right back the first 1,000 days and in terms of the impact on that. So it might be worth just finishing with some comment on, you know, how far back and how far forward we have to go in that sense from your experience in that educational piece of parents and young children.
Well, certainly at Next, we started focus probably more on primary, intermediate school age, and over time, as we understood the research more and more, we moved earlier and earlier, and really we got to a place where the biggest impacts you can have are in the first 1,000 days, and that's from 9 months before birth through to, you know, probably 2.5 years of age. So that's where the real brain development happens. So for the young person, that's where the interventions have by far the most impact. And that's why Next has morphed towards a much greater focus on that area. That's, if you go back 10 or 15 years, we didn't have all the brain research that we have now that tells us all this. So there's very clear scientific evidence that backs up what intuitively a lot of people knew, that is the area to really focus on. But you need to stay the course right throughout a young person's life. But certainly those first couple of years are just critical.
Thank you, everyone. We could talk for a long time on this, but our 1 hour session is coming up, and I found it incredibly interesting to learn all about the different perspectives. Matt Chandler-Wall from AON is just going to close this session, and thank you everyone today. Thank you.
Thanks, Misha. So Matt Chandler-Wall, I'm the General Manager here at AON in Auckland, New Zealand. So thanks everyone for attending today. This is a joint event between AON and DLA Piper. We hope you found it really informative. I certainly have. It's certainly changed some of the thoughts I've been thinking about in terms of the team that I lead here. Look, I hope you got lots out of the topics. A great set of panelists who've got some really interesting thoughts about how we sort of think about this topic and take it forward into the businesses that we run. So if you're interested, there's lots of other events in terms of the Dive-In Festival. Please have a look at diveinfestival.com. I've also made a recording of this webinar, which will be available in the website in due course. So thank you all today. Thank you for the panelists for being here. Thanks to Clem for staying up late in the UK, and Anya and Ewen for joining us too, and the team at DLA Piper for helping AON and DLA put this together. So hope you all have a great day. Really thanks again for coming along.